Welcome to the recorded version of How AI is Transforming Learning. Our webinars are fairly interactive experiences, and we don't actually record the live sessions just because people will interact a little bit less if they know they're being recorded. If this is the first recording you listen to from Sprout Labs, I'm Robin Pettard, the founder of Sprout Labs, the host of the Learning Way Working podcast and virtual conference. I'm also quite often the front person for Sprout Labs, the first point of contact, and also the person who does a lot of our content work as well. Sprout Labs is new to you. We essentially build digital learning authoring platforms that enable you and your team to author, deliver, and measure high-impact digital learning ecosystems. The three platforms we work with is Glasshouse, and Glasshouse is a cloud-based content authoring system. It gives you just a different level of flexibility about what you can do. The platforms we use for delivery is Tatara Learn, an open enterprise learning management system, and Tatara Social, a open social enterprise system. All of our learning technology ecosystems is powered by XAPI data, and in the background, everything's sort of moving backwards and forwards between the components of the ecosystems using XAPI data, which is part of the reason why we're really interested in data-driven approaches and machine learning. We're actually currently working on a new product that uses machine learning to work with XAPI data as well. Other content that comes from Sprout Labs includes the Learning Way Working podcast, the blog, ebooks that come out on a regular basis, and there's a recording of past webinars as well, and our virtual conference. Our first virtual conference was in 2018, and all the recordings are available on our website. As I'm recording this particular session, there's another one being planned for August 2019 as well. So, what is AI? It's really the idea that software is trying to simulate the way people think. Artificial intelligence and AI is not a new idea. It's been around since the dawn of computers, where people have been able to sit there and try to think through how can we make computers more like humans by thinking in different ways. AI is affecting L&D in two ways. It's changing the capabilities we need to be focused on, and it's also changing how L&D works at a fundamental level as well. This is essentially how I'm splitting up this particular session. The first half talks about the capabilities that L&D needs to focus on and what that means, and also during this first half, I'm weaving through a bit of an introduction to AI and machine learning as well. Then the second half really dives into some of the ways that data and machine learning and AI is starting to be used in L&D at the moment, and looking at a series of platforms that give you a sense of the possibilities. The future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I love this particular quote from William Gibson, and in some ways that's what we're doing today in this particular recording. I'm looking at things that are at the edge of what L&D practices at the moment, and quite often these things are pointing to what might be happening in the near future or the distant future as well. The World Economic Forum has actually hinted and said and called, not hinted, has called the time we're going through at the moment is the fourth industrial revolution. For me, it feels like the early days of the World Wide Web, where in 1994 we all knew that there was something new and exciting, but we weren't quite sure what its real potential was. Figuring out how to use it. It was overhyped, overpromised, not really completely functional, but there was all these possibilities. At the same time, some of the fear that I hear from people around machine learning and AI is also very similar to what used to happen with the internet. So if you've signed up to some of Sprout Labs content, you know that there's an automatic message that comes out where I ask people questions to try to spark a beginning of a conversation. By the way, I really enjoy those conversations that are sparked from those automatic email messages. I know they're automatic, but there is I do really respond to all of them. So the one at the moment that's around AI is asking why L&D is not adopting AI. And I got this response back from someone one day who was working on a major workforce planning project for an industry that's looking like it might be halved in the next 5 years. And she sort of said, "Oh, look, AI is never going to work. It's going to be too impersonal. It's too unpredictable. It's not reliable. It's not secure." And if I remove the AI word, it would be exactly what the pessimistic people were thinking around e-commerce in the 90s. And now we're in a spot where, yes, it is actually close to 30 years on, where it's totally revolutionized actually how things are totally working. During this first section, I'm going to be talking about some research from the World Economic Forum that they did last year. It's a survey of 317 chief HR officers on trends between 2018 and 2022. It's not a particularly large sample size, but essentially the organizations that these chief HR officers were working for were considerable in their scale. So it's actually, I think, represented something like 10 million people as well, in terms of the numbers of people that were being surveyed and thought about with this particular particular piece of research. Now, the pessimistic view on the future of work is the number of people in the workforce is going to be reduced and less learning is needed. Learning is going to be automated. Now, do sometimes wonder whether or not where that research is coming from. Is it coming from people who are thinking, they're going, yes, your workforce is going to be downsized and you need us to help you be in the spot where you're coping with those changes? Is that why that research has that particular slant on it? Also hinting at an idea that you can always find a piece of research that actually backs up your ideas. I think we're in what's called the age of abundance. Peter Diamond is an entrepreneur who also publishes a great weekly newsletter that talks about the latest innovations and research that's happening in the bleeding edge of technology. He sort of uses this idea that anything's possible at the moment. And I think that's actually really not a nice frame of mind to think from and work through with these types of technologies. And this particular piece of research came up with the same sort of finding, that yes, 75 million jobs may decline in the next few years, but there'll be an increase of probably 130 million jobs as well in particular areas that are high growth and high need. There will actually be, in terms of this particular time, a potential increase of around 58 million people. So there's a considerable sort of growth and abundance and time when new things are happening. Yes, old jobs are declining. The actual jobs that were talked about in the survey are mapped out on this slide. So there's things that you sort of predict, like data analysts increasing, but data entry clerks and assembly workers decreasing. And likewise, software application developers going up. What's really fascinating for us is org development specialists, people who are sort of looking at changes and how organizations change and what they need into the future are actually more needed. So I actually don't think L&D is a discipline at all that's in that sort of area which is in decline. We actually live in a time of incredible potential for the area. Why is AI having this effect at this particular moment? I hinted at the fact that it's been around for a long time, and it's actually because of a growth of a technique within AI. Now, you might have even noticed me at the beginning of this particular session starting to sort of mash up the words of AI and machine learning, because quite often they now sort of go together. It's been the growth of the techniques around machine learning that really has made AI mature at this point. Machine learning can really make decisions in controlled situations. It works, and this is why the learning bit happens, and I'll explain this in a few moments, by finding patterns in data. Which means that sort of, routine work can be automated. The other two things that are critical as well is the growth of the amount of data that's available for us in the world. So essentially machine learning needs lots and lots of data to work well. And then the other side of this as well is it actually involves lots of computational power. So the cost of computers have got to a point where being able to do all of these calculations to find the patterns are finally actually really achievable and affordable. So how does machine learning? So this is my crash course in about 6 slides of what machine learning does. Now, anyone who knows me knows I'm a coffee addict. I'm always willing to have a cup of coffee with anyone. So I'm going to use coffee cups or pictures of coffee cups as a way of explaining this. And also using image recognition as well as a way of explaining it, because essentially it's a really nice way of being able to visually explore it. So essentially, a data scientist starts with a machine learning system by training. It starts to show it particular things. So in this case, we're looking at cups. So it shows the cup. Then it says what features are important in the cup. So it might be the handle on the side of the cup that's actually the key feature that the machine learning system needs to look for in the pattern. So the curves bit or the contrast between two things. So then the data scientist shows the machine learning system lots and lots of cups. I'm not talking like tens of cups. I'm talking like thousands of cups. Then from those, after seeing those sort of thousands and thousands of cups, it builds up a model of what a cup looks like. This is sort of like an abstract set of rules and patterns that exist within the machine learning system. So then what happens is you can show it another cup, and the machine learning systems can sit there and say, yeah, okay, based on the model, this looks like it's 80% like a cup. So that is very specific in my language. I'm not saying this is a cup. It's saying it's likely a cup. And that's one of the things that some people don't take a little while to get their head around. It's quite confusing because it's not actually quite often a binary thing. And quite often the machine learning systems will actually sit there and say it's 70% like this, but 75% like this, and quite close in its interpretation. So what I'm talking about here is a type of machine learning called supervised learning. It's actually giving an end result and then training the system on what that result is. So there's another type of machine learning that I'll talk about. So essentially, with this type of machine learning, which is actually great for doing types of analytics work, you show the machine learning system lots and lots of data, lots and lots of images in this case, and then it starts to find patterns. It looks for things that are similar within all of that data, and then starts to group those together. It doesn't actually name them. It just sits there and says, okay, there's this group of things here. This is called unsupervised learning because essentially there's no thing at the beginning or the top to be able to sit there and say this is exactly what it actually is. So those are the two most common types of machine learning, and a little bit of a non-technical description as well. Here's my crash course in AI in one slide. So essentially, we've just been talking about here about machine learning and supervised types of machine learning. Essentially, in learning, and these are the things that are used for recommendation systems and personalization, or seeing whether or not particular learners are at risks. The unsupervised type of machine learning is used for analytics, and then less work is actually happening around using what's called decision trees. Decision trees are these sort of complicated decision matrix that are often built up using a machine learning system to then build up the decision tree. So it goes like through a very complicated if then bits and pieces. More complicated than normal binary logic, by the way, as well. So even if I'm using a binary way of talking about it of if then, it actually doesn't quite often work like that. Then there's another set of technologies called natural language processing. These quite often use a mixture of all the other ones as well. And these are a cluster of technologies that are trying to understand the way language works. Google and some of the Amazon are working and doing a lot of work around natural language processing. And as you probably experienced with some of those things, if you try Siri or OK Google, they don't particularly work well. But there's lots of potential to actually happen here as well. And these are some of the things they're starting to and examples of things. These are chatbots or systems that go through learning things and find what topics are being covered. Or I'll talk later about some things that look for topic and sentiments in social data as well. So an example of this is we had a medical educator come to us and sit there and say, "Hey, Robin, I've been working with doctors that are struggling to get through their exams for the last few years. I've developed this model where I look at what people have done in the past in terms of study and what sort of patients they see and what their own demographics are as well. And then I build up a study plan based on the 100 topics they need to get through their exam." So when I looked at this problem, I just sat there and went, "Oh yeah, this is just a classic if-then statement thing." And the data scientist in the team said, "No, what we'll do is we'll build a data set and then we'll train that a decision tree to go through what all those different factors are and factor them all in." So essentially, we got a fairly small set of data together that basically listed out all the features of what the doctors were, and then what, if they had those features, then what they should focus on in their study plan, and then ran one of these machine learning systems across it to build up the decision tree. One of the things I find really fascinating about this particular project was that it didn't take the machine learning data scientist person a long time to build this system. Probably actually took them less time to build the actual machine learning system, and rather than actually going through and thinking out all of the bits and pieces for the if-then statements. So back to thinking about the survey and future of work. And part of when we're talking about the future of work, we talk about automation. Just to be really clear, automation is not AI. AI makes automation smarter. And there's a series of industries that are already being revolutionized by automation and robots. And this slide has mapped out some of these things. Quite often, things are actually quite physical things, like the oil and gas industry area. So my son has just recently finished a degree in robotics engineering. And what's interesting is he's actually literally sat there and said the physical parts of robotics are actually resolved. The robotic arms and the sensors and the mechanics of those, that's the easy part of robotics. It's the software part of it. The figuring out actually how the robots work, that's where all the challenges are. So he's actually literally, even after a degree that's sort of seen as being highly desirable and cutting edge, then actually really already made a move into being a data scientist very quickly. So the survey also maps out a series of skills, and I think the skills are really fascinating in terms of what sort of is declining. Things like manual dexterity skills and just straightforward management of personnel, because people will be becoming more self-guided. But what's growing is things like analytical skills, active learning is number 2, and creativity. So that's sort of thing that probably the things on the left-hand side are what we want in all of our people at the moment, but we're not always in the spot where we're developing those skills. I think about this fourth industrial revolution is it focuses on what it means to be human. If machines can do the repetitive tasks, the analytical work, and possibly sometimes do the analytical work better than us, it really focuses on what it means for us to be humans. And for me, this is 3 things. Humans create, we collaborate, we're social and emotional, and also, even if we sometimes are not particularly good at it, humans are more adaptable to change. And the fact that we've actually evolved is that sort of symbol that we actually do work with change, okay, over a longer period of time, maybe than what most organizations would like us to change. So, back to the survey. 53% of these chief HR officers felt like their actual organizational future work strategy wasn't actually prepared to make these shifts. which is a little bit scary because we're only talking about a short-term thing, and then for people to sit there and say, actually, we don't think we're really quite ready for this yet, and only half of them were thinking that. The other side of it was when asked about how people were thinking about shifting their workforces, most people sit there and think about that sort of loss of 40% of jobs, reducing numbers, and then recruiting in people who are in the new areas. But the reality, everyone's going to be in a spot where they're looking for those same people. So what it then becomes down to is that it's actually easier to grow your own people. A lovely story and a way of explaining this and to think about it is that it's actually easier to take a bank teller who knows what customers need, knows the financial system, knows a company, and turn them into a data analyst rather than actually bringing a graduate in who might be okay at analytical thinking skills, but has no idea really what customers need or what the organization's about. It's actually faster to take those existing people who have all that organizational knowledge and reskill them. So what does this mean for L&D? I think it's a great opportunity to grow learning in our organizations, to become more future focused and really focus on bringing new skills into our organizations really quickly. My mantra is we need to be learning while working, and this becomes even more critical. So to move on to the second part of this particular recording and session, and this is really about how AI is being used by the L&D function in organizations at the moment. Recently done a podcast series on the Learning While Working podcast, where I've tried to talk to as many people as possible who are working with AI and learning technologies. I haven't got everyone, and even there's one particular scenario I talk about in this particular session that is actually not part of the podcast series. Also, if you're watching this particular webinar and you haven't downloaded it yet, there's actually a full transcripts and an introduction that actually covers some of the same ground that we've done in this particular webinar available on the website as well. So to map this all out into some of the current ways AI has been using in L&D. So I've sort of think about it as two things. One, AI being used to change the learning experience, and then two, for using it for gaining insights. So with personalization and recommendation with a delivery spot, that's one of the most powerful things. But at the same time, being able to see really who's struggling and maybe which learning's not working in terms of insights, quite valuable across the area. Now, at the top, I've got chatbots. I didn't quite expect when I started this particular podcast series that I was going to be spending so much time focused on chatbots. But I suppose I started to sort of reach out to a couple of people and found the conversations really interesting, and actually found that there was a whole lot of really interesting applications happening for chatbots now. And I think that's a really nice spot. And in actual fact, if you're thinking about trying to get started in any of these types of new technologies, chatbots are probably the first point of call. The thing also with chatbots is they look like they have a human intelligence, but they quite often don't really have that complicated set of machine learning or the neural networks behind them. They're actually quite often quite simple bits of technology. So for the rest of the recording, I'm going to be following Ruby. Ruby's a data-driven L&D person. So this is her day. She checks her dashboards, sees that Sam's struggling, sees that a discussion topic in a course is not working at the moment, but also sees through the social data that actually there's a video that's getting a real lot of valuable comments. So the other things she does during the day is update the orientation chatbot, then does some of her own learning using Magpie from Filtered, and then works with Zoomy to figure through how to break up an existing course into some smaller bits of micro learning so she can personalize the learning experiences more. She works with Quillian to build some knowledge questions, and finally, at the end of the day, she actually takes her own learning break to work with her own chatbot as well. So what's Ruby not doing? She's not really figuring out what learning's right for people. The personalization systems and the recommendation systems are doing that. In a perfect world, they're bringing in KPIs and performance objectives as well. They're actually thinking through where she's at with her knowledge and suggesting new things, and not just building them based on what she's seen in the past. She's building what she needs to be doing rather than what she might be interested in doing as well. What she is still doing is feeding the learning experiences into the systems, and that's the sort of the higher level creative and analytical sort of skills. So during the first part of the day, Ruby was looking at her dashboards. It's actually quite hard to figure out really what's happening in social learning programs and really figure out the sort of what's the value of them. And Curator, a platform from H2 Labs, gives this. So essentially, it's got a series of dashboards that's sitting there saying which particular learning experiences and what particular curated objects are actually having the best response. What H2 Labs have done is built a model of what is a good high-level thinking skill and response. So what they actually have done, and I think this is quite an extraordinary thing because it's actually not to do with so much machine learning. They've gone through 100,000 comments and had a person go through them and actually literally rate whether or not that comment is a higher value comment or it's a lower value comment. Is that comment insightful? So that then when the machine learning system comes to new comments, it sort of matches them up against that model that's been trained to sit there and go, is this a high level response or is this just a low level response? Is someone actually having an insight, or are they just saying, oh yeah, that's interesting as well, thank you? And just sort of being able to sort those gives a different level of insight into social learning experiences. The other thing with a system from H2 Labs, it actually brings in data not just from Curator, because it's working with a learning record store, and HT2 Labs is actually the people behind Learning Locker. Learning Locker is the platform we use for our learning record store at Sprout Labs. It's actually the most installed learning record store in the world. So essentially, it's not just working with data and comments that's coming in from Curator. It could be coming in from your other social network systems like Yammer and Slack as well. So this means that she's actually in a spot where through these types of things, she can actually start to sit there and go, which discussion topics aren't getting the high level skills that she's after and high level thinking. So she can revise those. She can pick up that video that was seen on Yammer and actually sit there and go, yeah, that's actually getting some really interesting thinking happening behind it. Let's share that with more people. So then she's also looking at the dashboard for the orientation program and seeing that the one particular person's looking like they're struggling. And this is sort of interesting because essentially she's sitting there going, so this person compared to other people is not doing as well. So a couple of different platforms that allow this type of thing is Zooming, and the platform that Sprout Labs is working on at the moment called Yield, which is essentially building up and looking at XAPI data to build models to then be able to build predictions. Zooming is fascinating because it actually reaches in and somehow works with your existing platforms to be able to work with the data as well. So essentially, this sort of predictive model is doing this sort of, the way I think about it is you have a cohort of people, and essentially it's looking at what's happened in the past and trying to see if someone's actually at the edge. So this then means you can do things like sit there and go, is this person struggling? Is this person the right fit for this job maybe? Or is this person thinking about moving on? Or it gives a different type of tool to be able to read people's data, body language basically, and get different types of insights, and not just insights based on basically insights based on what's actually happened in the past as well. So This particular type of approach where people are using predictive machine learning and predictions in machine learning to figure out whether or not people are struggling or are behind is something that the universities have been doing for quite a while. So to see what students are at risk. Mark Sharkley has been one of the people who've been leading this particular area at Blackboard. Was the first person I actually interviewed for the podcast series. And I expected him to be sort of shiny and all sort of AI is so fantastic, machine learning and analytics has really transformed higher education. In actual fact, he really brought me down to the ground. He actually sort of talked about the fact that, especially in the education sector, and actually probably, and really in all learning areas, there's just so many outside factors at play, and especially in the university sector, that they could possibly sit there and quite often say that a person was struggling, but it was very hard to sit there and say what exact interventions they needed to help them. That there quite often wasn't a sort of linear relationship. It's not like e-commerce where there's a big buy now button. You might go and browse some stuff and then be able to be in a spot where you sit there and go, yes, this is the thing. Healthcare has the same issues. So Ruby's keeping on working across the day, and one of the things she was working on was some chatbots. Now, the chatbot in Ruby's organization gives just-in-time information in her intranet and CRM. The platform that she's using is Mobile Coach. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning Mobile Coach was because I started to explore the whole area of chatbots and see who was doing what. Basically, it was started with Jamie Good, who talked about essentially using chatbots for performance support in learning. And then Emma Weber, who I'll talk about in a little while, who's using chatbots for learning transfer. Basically, they all came back to using the Mobile Coach platform. So if you're thinking about out of this particular session, chatbots, I think the one of the best places to start is with the Mobile Coach platform. Another chat platform that I came across was Otto from Learning Pool. And this is really fascinating because essentially, rather than being sort of pre-programmed in what it was doing, Otto reaches into your intranet and also your learning experiences to be able to sort of sit there and build up a series of possible answers. So if you actually sat there and did something like searched on recruitment processes, if you were thinking about bringing a new person into the organization, yes, it might toss up and sit there and say, here's the procedure that you need to think about, but it also will sit there and say, here's our course on recruitment. So it actually doesn't just give back information from the internet, it was bringing in multiple different things. Now, another nice platform that Ruby's using during the day is Magpie. So just after lunch, she's actually focusing on some of her own learning by going into Magpie. And Magpie is a particular service that's been set up for free by Filtered. Filtered actually has a learning recommendation system. And Magpie is a version of that that's designed for L&D people. So essentially, you go on to Magpie, you work with a chatbot again, and the chatbot asks you a series of questions to profile what you're actually interested in. And then essentially make recommendations upon that as well. Now, what's really interesting is that Filter's a recommendation engine. And during this podcast with Mark, I actually asked him a question about what was his thoughts on the Netflix of learning. And we really explored this a little bit more. And there's been other people who talked about the whole notion that we don't need a Netflix of learning. Netflix is really content-driven. It's passive engagement. It's actually trying to get you to go from one thing to another thing to binge watch. Quite often also heavily optimized to actually keep you watching and keep you engaged in Netflix content rather than anything else. So it's actually quite a passive type of engagement. It also is a model where essentially it's giving you more of what you're already interested in, rather than sort of opening up new types of possibilities. There's a few people who's now starting to sort of talk about the Spotify of learning as well. I don't know if this is really actually the best types of metaphors to be using. These things like Spotify and Netflix are entertainment platforms. Yes, it would be great if most workplace learning was a little bit more entertaining and a bit more engaging, but then probably the recommendation engine side of that is not the thing we should be focusing on. So Ruby's sitting down working on some micro learning. So she's actually using Zumo to do this. So Zumo is going through her existing resources. She's finding out which ones are actually the bits that are actually the most engaging and working the best. And also Zumi's doing these fantastic things where it's modeling what topics it is. So she's not actually having to go through the whole resources because someone else built them 3 or 4 years ago. So then she's sort of figuring out which bits to sort of break up into micro learning to then actually use Zumo to make personalizations as well. There's a strong link between micro learning and personalization. If you have smaller parts of learning, it's easier to split them up into bits which you can feed out to people. Another type of adaptive personalization system that has some really nice smarts in it is the Anoxified platform as well. So one of the people I didn't get to interview on the podcast was a new product from Hamburger Interactive called Quillian. So Ruby's using Quillian to write knowledge questions for her. She's just literally put in a piece of chunks of text, and Quillian sort of picks up and sits there and goes, all right, in the text there's a definition here. Okay, so we can turn that definition into a multiple choice question. What might be some of the other variations in the text that with this definition that could be confused with? So it's actually starting to look at automating the instructional design process. So this is particularly one project that I came across at Learning Solutions. There's also another product from Learning Pool called Wildfire that does the same sort of thing where it reaches into text to be able to work through things. So finally, Ruby spends the last part of her day working with her coach, M, from Learning Lever. So essentially what Coach M is a learning transfer tool. Emma Weber from Learning Lever has a deep knowledge of learning transfer as a discipline. And her model has been working with coaches to help people have learning conversations, to help them reflect on what they've been doing, barriers as well. So when Emma's come to the notion of digitalizing this, she's wanted something that has that same sort of level of interaction, and she's ended up in a spot where the chatbots have been her her solution. So essentially what it does is be in a spot where you feed into a free online planning tool, which anyone can use, by the way, in terms of free after training experience action planning. And then the bot picks up what those actions were and then asks you questions about whether or not you actually achieved those and how you're going on those as well. So it becomes a sort of automated reflective process. What's really fascinating is Emma expected people to sort of engage less with the bot. She actually found that people still did quite often spend 20 minutes with the bot when they were having a learning conversation, working through with it. And then the bot would actually people would do things like actually wish the bot Merry Christmas as well. So they started to get an odd sort of level of personal connection to it because it was responding back to them. So the changes in that practice of L&D that's happening is essentially two things. Automation in terms of the personalization of learning, making recommendations, and chatbots actually automating parts of the learning and performance system as well. The other change is that machine learning and AI just gives really different abilities to be able to gain new insights from data, to be able to make predictions about what people might do into the future and understand the sentiments of what people are doing as well. So hopefully with this particular section of the webinar, I've been able to translate some of the sort of more nebulous ideas into the actual practice of what we're doing in L&D. Now, What's I think is really interesting is what's actually happening already is we're automating and augmenting the delivery process with, say, recommendations and personalization. What isn't happening so much, and Quillian is starting to hint at it, is the automation and augmentation of of actual learning design, and really data-driven approaches to learning design, where essentially there's automated systems that sit there and say, yes, in actual fact, these types of approaches in the past have actually worked. This particular context of this particular problem is slightly different. You need to be thinking about this in A, B, and C instead. Cool. So that brings me to the end of my session, where I've sort of made this sort of idea about that there is actually a gap out there as well. Look, if you want to talk about data-driven approaches to learning, please just reply to one of the messages from Sprout Labs and start a conversation with me. Really hope you've found this recording useful, and it's given you a little bit of a guide and map to AI and L&D.